About a month ago, I picked up this ash log from a neighbor's yard, from a tree they were getting rid of, to see if there was any chance I'd be able to mill it down into more usable lumber. Let's find out. The first thing to do is to create a sort of sacrificial sled that will run just parallel to the blade along the bandsaw. To do that, I'm going to use this old shelf. This is going to be made in much the same way that I would make a crosscut sled for the table saw, except it just has the one rail, and obviously I'm not going for perfection here because this is a slat I had that happened to work, and it's a little bit shorter, but it should be fine. There is just shy of 3.5 inches between the blade and the edge of the rail slot on the bandsaw, so I need to mark that out and make sure I get this squared up on it perfectly, and then I'm just going to glue and screw this in place. While the glue's drying on the sled, let's talk about some of the decisions that have to be made here. You might be thinking, first of all, this looks awfully big for the bandsaw, and you're right. I have no idea if this is going to work. I know no matter what, it's going to be really pushing the limits of what this bandsaw can do, but how do you figure out what the limits are if you never push them? Obviously I'm going to have to move the blade guard up. I'm also most likely going to have to cut with this front guard open, just to get that extra little bit of clearance that this doesn't allow, this inch or so here. Obviously that's not ideal, but I don't see a way around it in this case. So I'll just be very careful and hopefully not die. The other thing to consider as I'm sawing this, and again this is mostly for a test so I don't necessarily care that much about how well the lumber turns out, but obviously if I can get it to turn out well, I'd like it to, is on both ends we have pretty severe cracks, and again this was essentially firewood that was sitting out for a few months. Not terribly long, and you know, it's still definitely salvageable. But the question is, how deep do these cracks go? If they're a couple inches in, it doesn't really matter either way. If they're deeper than that, that could be an issue across multiple boards. I believe the most severe one runs parallel to the surface of the bandsaw table as I have the log arranged right now on this side. And so I have to debate whether or not I want to have that all included in one board and do most of my sawing rotated 90 degrees, or some other variation. And I'm thinking what I'll do is what I just said. So I'll make my first cut to establish a square edge, essentially in this orientation, adjust it a little bit, but in the general direction. Just give me a square edge, and that'll also shave off some of the height that I have to worry about, which will hopefully make this a little more stable on the bandsaw. And then I can flip the whole thing 90, have a nice flat edge to reference, use the sled again just to make sure I get a square edge to that, and then the rest I can just cut with the fence or however else I want to do it. So let's finish this sled up and see if I can get this bad boy cut. So the idea is, the sled has a little rail on it, which obviously goes in the slot here. I've measured it out. I believe there is enough room on the blade. I don't have the blade guide on here, so it is more likely to drift than usual, but again, this can be relatively rough. Let's do a quick check to see if that'll...
Probably not.
It's the little thing for the...
It's going to hit right here, but that might just be at the very edge. I think actually if you tip it...
Yeah, I don't want to tip it though, because it'll twist most likely. You want to keep it as flat as possible just for safety.
No, but just to get through that part, I think it's right at the edge.
I think you're right. I think everywhere else is fine. Well, if I'm going to do that, I'm just going to chisel out a little notch right there.
Well, why don't we get it started? Do you think we'll be able to release it if we hit that point? And
yeah.
Okay. Why don't we get it started so you'll at least know where the notch has to be?
Can you open the blast gate and make sure all the others are closed?
Which is the blast gate?
It's the one with the black hose coming out of it.
Oh, sorry.
I guess there's some stuff in there. One thing I hadn't really accounted for was the holder for the blade guide, the column that holds it. And I just kept hitting it, so what you don't see in this video is several hours of me chiseling away a notch so that I can effectively avoid hitting that little post. It was very annoying, and I wish I had realized it from the get-go, so I could have adjusted it better. But I did end up figuring it out, and we were able to clear a bit of a notch, and it worked okay. All the footage you see that's sped up here is sped up 8 times, so you can tell this was a very slow process. I had to keep catching myself from stalling out the bandsaw. You could hear the blade start to catch, and so I did my best to anticipate that. I messed up a couple times and we had to stop. One time I accidentally actually tripped the fuse because the motor was just drawing too much power. So there were a lot of little obstacles from this being a perfectly smooth cut. But I'm editing those out because I know you don't want to see them.
And quick!
Yeah. It only took forever. So you can see, it's obviously not the best cut quality, and even sighting down the length of it, quite a bit of drift in that blade. I think part of that was actually the table moving as well, just because it was holding a lot of weight. Making progress. So having taken the log off the sled, you can see the amount of drift was actually pretty catastrophic. that is a very wavy cut. Now, part of that is because I don't have the upper blade guide on this, which is just going to inherently make the blade a little less stable. Even though I've got it pretty well tensioned in there, there's probably a 32nd of an inch, if that, of actual play in the blade. But part of it is the twisting it can do, which is partially the just blade being only a half-inch blade. I could conceivably get a bigger one, which would probably be more stable for this sort of cutting. And also the fact that this was just a very challenging cut for the bandsaw. The thing that I'm worried about more than the waviness of the cut is whether or not I can clean it up, and I'm pretty sure I can. And so what I'm going to do is use this now relatively flat face, still not perfect obviously, but good enough, as a reference against the table, and then start cutting some strips off the sides here. And then once it's a little bit smaller, it'll be easier. Side note, you can also see the notch I had to kind of chisel out as I was going here to fit underneath the holder for the blade guard, or blade guide rather, which obviously means that with the sled attached to it, give or take, that is the maximum cut depth of this. So I was a little ambitious still, but that's still workable. Okay, so on the whole that cut went a little bit better. I'm still getting a bit of curve in the blade, so actually it comes out farther at the top and then gets back down to square towards the bottom. And again, I think if I just had that top blade guide in, I originally had the bandsaw plugged into an extension cord just because the wiring here is a little bit goofy. Having it plugged into the main outlet helped a bit. The motor didn't stall nearly as much. So I think it's just drawing too much power for the extension cord to be. Here's the piece I just cut off. If you sight along it, it's definitely better than the first cut. Still got some wiggly wobbliness to it. I don't know how easy that is to see, but it's not awful, which is good, especially because this is hopefully going to be the reference face I use against the fence. So now I don't believe I need the sled anymore, so I can take that off. And that'll also help the clearance, so that'll be good. And now it's a matter of putting the fence on and running this thing again. I'm probably going to do about what they would call 8/4 or 2-inch chunks out of this, which means I'll probably get 2 and then a decent size end piece that I can rip into smaller strips. These smaller awkward pieces, I might still be able to get some use out of them. Maybe a tool handle out of the thicker parts, or some sort of cool live edge thing. I don't know. But I went through this much effort to get them. I'm going to at least try to reuse them. So I'll keep these as well. Gonna try to make a cut. I got the fence lined up where I want it. And yeah, this is going to be the first one without the sled. Let's see if it's any different. small guy? I'll lift the big one. There you go. What ended up happening there was the cut I was referencing against the fence wasn't flat,
Ah.
so I had to kind of freehand it a little bit. Yeah, so it's still not square, but again,
Yep.
that's why I cut these kind of big, so I'd have room to mess with them. All right, and that is board / slab number 1. Ta-da! Yeah, it's highly uneven, but once again, I'm shooting for cutting them into usable sizes that I can deal with later. And I would say the quality on this one is definitely better than the opposite side. You can see a lot less burn marks.
That's true. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, it's getting better. So there you have it. I successfully milled 3 slabs out of that log. The question now is, was that worth it? I can pretty confidently say no. Now, it's great that I have this wood. I'm going to use it. I'm going to make great use of it, and I enjoyed the process of making it. There was absolutely no real sense in doing it like this, because to make these 3 not terribly even, not even close to square slabs behind me took many hours. I'd estimate it probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8, and that's not counting filming and all these other things. And I guess it depends on how you value your time, but white ash for, what I'm getting here would not cost, what I would value my time at for those 8 hours. So there's that. Now, I think it was a worthwhile exercise. It taught me a lot about the bandsaw, taught me a lot about pushing the limits of what my bandsaw can do, and just about kind of the general idea of this whole milling process. One thing I did learn, and this is probably pretty obvious to most of you, is that the drift in the bandsaw blade wasn't insignificant going along the length of the board, but it was most significant top to bottom. And that's because I didn't have the top blade guide on the bandsaw, which I couldn't because there was no way these logs would have fit with that guide in there. So I think I need to really consider that the maximum resaw capacity of my bandsaw, rather than the 8 or so inches I can fit if I take off all the bells and whistles, is more like the 6.5, 7 inches that I get with the guide on there. Because sawing at this quality it's not really worth much. I'm gonna have to go now, spend probably several hours on the jointer planer, probably do some hand tool work to get these to a point where they're going to be usable as beams. Obviously I'm going to cut them into smaller pieces, and I can always resaw them again, especially once I get some of the live edge off. Some people might hate me for saying that. I'm not a big fan of live edge stuff in my woodworking, sorry. That reduces the amount of cutting that I have to do, and the bandsaw can probably handle it better, and I can put the blade guides on there. So that's one thing. The wood was free, so I can't argue with that, but it's not all that hard to come by free wood, especially in New England, this neck of the woods, because everything is trees and they're coming down all the time, and people just want to get rid of them. It's decent quality lumber, I think. I think there's some cool grain pattern in here. This one especially, you can see a lot of the knots, and there's this, what I'm guessing was at one point some bark inclusion, or something similar to that causes this brown stripe here. And I'm sure once it's cleaned up, it's going to look great. But again, you have to factor in the amount of time. I could have gone to a lumber yard, got a piece of ash twice this size, for probably about the same amount of money that I would value the effort I put into this. And it would be mostly square. Might have to clean it up a little bit on the joiner, but it wouldn't be, nowhere near square like these are. So, all in all, it was an experiment, and it was a successful experiment because I learned something. I learned not to try to saw logs this big on the bandsaw. I think if it were half this size, it would have no trouble whatsoever. The trick is, logs half this size, you're not going to get a whole lot of usable lumber out of, unless you're making pen blanks or something small like that, which is valid. So yeah, should you saw logs into lumber on a small bandsaw? Probably not. Probably not worth your time. But hey, it was interesting, and now I still do have these pieces of wood. So I hope that answers that question. I'm going to have these dry for a bit. I checked with the moisture meter. They're pretty good already. They've been sitting out for a while. But I think the internal stuff, I'm going to have to check them again, but the internal moisture is probably going to be higher because that's how wood works. So I'm going to check these and then let them dry. I'm hoping within 4 or 5 months they'll be fine if I keep them inside here. And then I hope you'll be able to see me clean these up more and use them in future projects. There you go. 3 slabs of ash. So, if you like this video, learning the processes and the failures that I had in the process of sawing these pieces behind me, please do like and subscribe. It means a ton to me. Make sure you hit the bell to get a notification each time I post a new video, which I am trying to do once a week. Work's getting a little bit busy, so I'm doing as much as I can. But, I'll do what I can, and it should be reasonably frequent nonetheless. And I think that about does it for this one. So I will see you in the next video, and we'll make some more stuff. Have a good one.